Mary was not a virgin, and the Church knew it from the very beginning. Yet for centuries it chose to weave a story so powerful that it would hold entire civilizations in awe and obedience. And here is where the truth becomes almost unbearable. Because if the tale of the Virgin Mary is nothing more than a fabrication, then the entire structure of Christianity rests on a myth crafted not by heaven, but by men who sought power, control, and obedience. So ask yourself right now, what would it mean if the foundation of faith itself was engineered through one word? One mistranslation, one deliberate twist of meaning, because behind the candles, incense, and sacred hymns, there hides a shocking reality that the Church has fought desperately to bury, a reality that scholars, historians, and even courageous priests have whispered about for centuries. And the explosive truth is this: the image of Mary as a spotless Virgin Mother was never universally accepted in the earliest Christian communities. It was not central to the original teachings. It was not even a detail emphasized in the earliest texts. Rather, it was slowly carved, polished, and then enforced through councils, dogmas, and threats until it became untouchable. But history, when examined closely, refuses to stay silent, and the cracks in the story are everywhere. Cracks that lead us straight to the uncomfortable conclusion that Mary was likely not a virgin, and that the so-called virgin birth was a myth imported from surrounding cultures. A myth repackaged and sanctified by a church desperate to rival the legends of gods and emperors that filled the ancient world. So why did they do it? Why build such a dangerous lie? The answer lies in power, because controlling the image of Mary as pure, undefiled, and unattainable gave the Church a weapon against its followers, particularly women. It placed virginity as the highest ideal and sexuality as a source of shame. It established authority over the most intimate aspect of human life, and in doing so secured loyalty, fear, and submission. Now imagine hearing this as a believer who for decades lit candles to the Virgin, who prayed rosaries begging for her intercession, who found comfort in her image of purity, only to be told that this entire story was orchestrated by those who sought to dominate minds. Is that not the deepest betrayal? But let us begin with the text itself, because here lies the first smoking gun, the prophecy in the book of Isaiah. In Hebrew, it reads that a young woman would conceive. The word is alma, which means young woman of marriageable age, not virgin. Yet when later translated into Greek as the Septuagint, the word was rendered as parthenos, which does mean virgin. And from that mistranslation, a legend was born. Think about that. The entire myth that Mary gave birth without sexual union rests on a translation error, or perhaps more sinister, an intentional twist. One word changed and billions of lives shaped. Does that not send chills down your spine? Now skeptics might argue that this is just semantics, but consider this. In Jewish culture at the time, there was nothing shocking about a young married woman conceiving a child. It was expected, normal, natural, but the Greco-Roman world into which Christianity was spreading was filled with tales of divine men born from virgins. Perseus, Dionysus, even Alexander the Great was rumored to have been conceived in a supernatural way. For early Christians, competing in that religious marketplace, they needed their Savior to have credentials equal or superior to the pagan gods. Thus the virgin birth was not a divine fact, but a marketing strategy, a theological weapon crafted to give Christianity the same mystical allure. And once this myth was seeded, it grew like wildfire. Councils later enshrined it as dogma, sermons exalted it as proof of divinity, and questioning it became heresy, punishable by excommunication, or worse. But ask yourself, who benefits from this? Certainly not Mary, who in reality would have been a young Jewish woman living under Roman occupation, likely married to Joseph. With all the normal realities of family life, she becomes stripped of her humanity, transformed into a symbol that never existed, and certainly not the ordinary believers who were taught to revere virginity while being told that their own desires were sinful. No, the beneficiaries were the bishops, the popes, the theologians who used this myth as a cornerstone of control, for by declaring Mary a virgin, they set the stage for Christ to be divine, not just human. By elevating virginity, they justified celibacy for priests, a rule that bound clergy more tightly to the institution, and by declaring women holiest when untouched, they ensured generations of female submission. Do you see the layers of manipulation? This is not just a story about Mary. It is about how myths become tools of empire. And here is a chilling thought. If Mary was not a virgin, then the birth of Jesus was like any other birth, natural, human, ordinary. And if that is true, then where does the claim of divinity stand? What happens to the cornerstone of faith? Is it not built on sand? But here is where the plot thickens, because the Church knew these problems, and it spent centuries silencing anyone who dared to point them out. The Gnostics were branded heretics. Scholars who noticed the mistranslation were threatened. Manuscripts that contradicted the virgin myth were hidden in monasteries and vaults. And to this day, the Vatican's archives contain countless documents never seen by the public. What secrets are they hiding there? Why lock away the very texts that could tell the truth? Because they know that one revelation could collapse the illusion, and that revelation begins with the fact that Mary was not a virgin. This is not an attack on faith, but an unveiling of history, an attempt to free belief from the chains of deception, because the truth is always stronger than lies, no matter how beautifully decorated. So, as we step deeper into this investigation, remember the opening shock. One mistranslated word transformed a woman into a perpetual virgin and a mother of God. One manipulated story changed the course of history, and the Church has known it all along. Now ask yourself again, if this truth were revealed to the millions who still cling to the myth, would Christianity survive, or would it unravel overnight? We will soon find out as we explore the evidence the Church never wanted you to see. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The illusion will shatter forever, and what remains will be nothing but raw reality staring back at you. Now we go deeper into the heart of the historical and cultural evidence, and here the story grows even more unsettling, because the very foundation of the claim that Mary remained a virgin comes not from clear eyewitness testimony, nor from consistent ancient traditions, but from a selective weaving of texts, mistranslations, and cultural borrowings that the Church elevated into sacred doctrine. So let us first examine the Jewish context, because Mary herself was a Jewish woman, and in her time and culture marriage was expected, and virginity was never meant to be permanent. In Jewish law, a woman of marriageable age who conceived a child was not seen as miraculous, but as fulfilling her role in society. And here is where the manipulation begins, because the Hebrew word alma, which simply means young woman, was never meant to signify a woman who had not known a man. Yet when Greek translators rendered it as Parthenos, the stage was set for a myth to blossom. Now think carefully, what does it mean when the very foundation of the virgin birth rests on a word that was changed in translation? Does it not mean that faith as we know it was shaped by a slip of the pen, or perhaps an intentional choice to align the story with surrounding myths? And here is where the Greco-Roman influence becomes undeniable, because in the world where early Christianity was competing, religions were everywhere. Stories of gods born from virgins filled the culture. Perseus was born from Danae, who conceived by Zeus without physical contact. Dionysus was born through miraculous means. And Augustus the emperor himself was said to have had a divine conception story whispered about him. Can you see the pattern? Divine figures required supernatural births to prove their authority. And so for Christians spreading their message, it became a necessity that their Messiah not be merely born of flesh, but of divine intervention. Thus the virgin birth became not a fact of history, but a theological weapon forged in the heat of cultural competition. Now let us pause for a reflection. If the Christian story required mythic enhancements to compete with pagan religions, then what does that say about the authenticity of its claims? Does truth need embellishment? Does reality require invention? Or is invention always the mark of fear that without myth the movement would crumble? But the manipulation did not stop with the mistranslation. It was reinforced by layers of doctrine, councils, and writings by church fathers who knew the political power of virginity, because virginity was not only a religious symbol, but a political tool. By elevating Mary's virginity, the Church could hold her up as an impossible ideal for women to emulate, and in doing so, control the behavior of women across the empire. Sexuality was stigmatized, reproduction was only valued when aligned with church-sanctioned marriage, and women were taught that their highest calling was purity, obedience, and silence. Can you see how effective this strategy was? Half the population subjugated through the myth of a woman who was never allowed to be human. But the cracks never fully disappeared. Early Christian communities were divided on the virgin birth. Some accepted it. Others saw it as unnecessary or even absurd. The Gospel of Mark, the earliest Gospel, does not mention it at all. Paul, who wrote earlier than the Gospels, never once mentions Mary's virginity, nor a miraculous birth. Think about that. the very founder of Christian theology, did not speak of the virgin birth, nor did the earliest gospel. Only later do Matthew and Luke introduce it, suggesting it was a development, not an original teaching, a development likely influenced by the need to compete with pagan myths. So when defenders of the faith say that Mary's virginity is essential, they are defending an invention that emerged later, not an original truth. And here is another reflection. If something so central today was not central at the beginning, then what else has been added, reshaped, or fabricated? And if this story was born of competition, then faith itself is revealed as a construction, not a revelation. But let us push further, because history does not only show cracks, it shows deliberate strategy. By the 2nd century, the idea of Mary's virginity was being heavily promoted. Church fathers like Ignatius of Antioch and later Augustine tied it to salvation itself, saying that only through a virgin birth could Christ be free of original sin. Yet this too is a theological invention, for original sin, as a doctrine, was itself a later development, shaped by Augustine's own writings. So we see the layers of myth building upon myth, mistranslation leading to virgin birth leading to doctrine of sin leading to control of believers, each step locking people deeper into the cage of obedience. And here is where the emotional betrayal hits hardest, because the faithful believed they were honoring truth, when in fact they were venerating a carefully built structure of illusions. Now consider again the ordinary life of Mary, a Jewish mother in a small occupied land, likely married, likely bearing children, as many texts outside the official canon suggest, for the Gospels mention the brothers and sisters of Jesus, a fact the Church has twisted into explanations about cousins or spiritual siblings. But the plain reading is clear. Mary had more children, which means she was not perpetually virgin, yet the Church rejected the plain truth in favor of a myth. Why? Because the myth was more useful. It elevated Mary into a goddess-like figure, and in doing so gave the Church a bridge to attract pagans accustomed to female deities. Mary became a Christianized Isis, a divine mother clothed in purity, her image absorbing pagan devotion while redirecting it to the Church. Can you now see the brilliance and the cruelty of this strategy? It is the use of a woman's image to enslave the minds of millions. It is the rewriting of her humanity into propaganda. It is the ultimate theft of identity, and all because of a mistranslation and a desire for power. Now pause and ask yourself, if this truth were spoken loudly from pulpits today, if bishops admitted that the virgin birth rests on shaky ground, what would happen to the faith of billions? Would churches empty overnight? Would believers revolt? Or would the institution collapse under its own lies? Perhaps this is why silence is enforced, why archives are locked, why dissenters are punished. Because once the truth is unleashed, the myth cannot survive, and as we will see in the coming parts, this is only the beginning. The rabbit hole goes deeper, with suppressed documents, hidden gospels, and theological manipulations designed to bury the real story of Mary, a woman who was never the eternal virgin they made her out to be, but a human being caught in the gears of an empire of belief. Now we enter the darkest layer of this deception, because if mistranslations and cultural borrowings set the foundation, the true machinery of the virgin myth was powered by the Church itself, which seized upon the story and weaponized it to control minds, bodies, and souls for centuries. This is not speculation, but historical reality, for we can trace the progression of how councils and bishops took the fragile seed of a story and turned it into unchallengeable doctrine. And when you see the political motivations behind it, the entire illusion begins to collapse, because in the early centuries of Christianity, power was everything. Rival sects battled for dominance. Competing interpretations threatened to fracture the movement. And in that struggle, the image of Mary as a virgin became one of the most effective tools to establish supremacy. Think of the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century, convened not to clarify divine truth, but to unify an empire under Constantine's command. And though the virgin birth was not the main issue there, it became increasingly emphasized in later councils, as the identity of Christ was debated. For if Christ was to be declared fully divine, then his birth had to be extraordinary. Natural conception would have reduced him to the level of a prophet, but a virgin birth elevated him to a godlike figure. Thus the virginity of Mary became inseparable from the divinity of Christ, and anyone who questioned it was now threatening the very power of the Church. Can you see how this worked? By fusing Mary's virginity to Christ's divinity, The church ensured that one could not be doubted without the other collapsing. It created a house of cards where one myth supported another, and yet this fragile structure held because it was enforced with ruthless determination. Bishops declared it doctrine, preachers thundered it from pulpits, and those who disagreed were branded heretics, exiled, silenced, or burned. And here is where the emotional betrayal deepens, because this was not about faith but about control. If believers could be made to accept something as unnatural and biologically impossible as a virgin birth, then they could be made to accept anything. It was a test of loyalty, a demonstration of power, a way of saying, if you doubt this, you doubt God, so swallow the lie and prove your obedience. And the strategy did not stop there. By elevating virginity as the highest form of holiness, the church created a hierarchy where sexuality was stigmatized and celibacy was exalted. This had enormous consequences. Priests were bound to celibacy, which tied their loyalty to the institution. Women were told that their holiness increased the less they engaged in their natural desires, and generations of believers were taught that their very bodies were sources of shame. Reflect on that for a moment. What does it do to a civilization when billions are taught to see their bodies as dirty, when the natural act of love and reproduction is seen as tainted unless sanctified by the church? It creates dependence, guilt, and fear, exactly what rulers need to maintain power. Now let us ask a piercing question. Would such doctrines have survived if Mary had been allowed to remain human? If the truth that she lived as a normal woman had been taught, would the church have been able to command the same authority, or would the spell have broken centuries ago? Clearly they could not risk it, which is why they fought so ferociously to protect the myth. The perpetual virginity of Mary was declared dogma, meaning it could not be questioned, and by tying salvation itself to this belief, they locked believers into submission. But history shows that not all Christians accepted this without doubt. Some sects, like the Ebionites, rejected the virgin birth altogether. Yet these groups were crushed, their writings destroyed, their voices erased, because the official church had the backing of emperors and armies. And so the myth survived not by truth, but by force. And here is another layer of the manipulation. By creating Mary as a figure of unattainable purity, the church created an ideal that women could never reach yet were commanded to strive for: virginity until marriage, obedience to husbands, silence in the church. This was the formula, and the image of Mary was the tool. She was paraded as a model of womanhood, yet stripped of real humanity. Do you see how insidious that is? An entire gender reduced to silence through the weaponization of a myth. And the cruelty did not stop with women. Men too were chained by this doctrine, for they were told that holiness required suppression of desire, that priests must remain celibate, and so countless men suffered under vows they could not bear, leading to scandals, abuses, and hypocrisy that continue to this day, all because of a myth about a virgin birth. But the manipulation reached beyond sexuality. It became a tool of empire, for Mary's image as the Virgin Mother allowed the church to merge Christianity with older pagan devotions to mother goddesses: Isis in Egypt, Cybele in Rome, Demeter in Greece. The people were already accustomed to worshipping divine mothers, so the church absorbed that devotion, redirecting it to Mary, a human woman rewritten into a goddess figure. And by doing so they won over masses of pagans without losing control. It was a brilliant but sinister strategy, one that transformed a mistranslation into an empire. Now reflect on this. If the church could rewrite a Jewish mother into a pagan goddess to win followers, what else could they rewrite? What else in the faith is a carefully crafted illusion? This is the terrifying thought that lingers, because if the virgin myth was engineered, then perhaps the entire narrative of salvation has been engineered. And here lies the true danger. For once you pull at this thread, the whole fabric begins to unravel, yet the church has spent centuries reinforcing it. Marian apparitions, shrines, rosaries, feast days. Endless reinforcement of the image. Why? Because they know that if the myth dies, the authority collapses. The bishops and popes lose their grip, the faithful awaken, and the empire of obedience falls. This is why the truth about Mary's virginity has been suppressed with such intensity. And this is why exposing it now is more explosive than ever, because the modern world no longer burns heretics. Archives are being opened, scholars are free to speak, and believers are starting to ask the forbidden question. What if Mary was never a virgin at all? What if the church lied? And what if the truth has been staring at us from the beginning, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the courage of this moment to finally be revealed? The deception runs even deeper, because not only do mistranslations, cultural borrowings, and institutional power plays reveal the fragile foundation of the virgin birth myth, but there also exists a vast trail of suppressed documents, alternative narratives, and hidden traditions that paint an entirely different picture of Mary, one that the Church has fought tirelessly to conceal. And when you see how many texts were silenced, how many voices were erased, you will understand that this was not an accident of history, but a deliberate cover-up orchestrated to preserve a lie. For let us begin with the Gnostic writings discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, where a library of early Christian texts, long thought destroyed, came back into the light. These writings show communities of Christians who did not worship Mary as a virgin, nor Jesus as the product of supernatural conception, but who saw him as a teacher, a revealer of hidden wisdom, born like any other man. In the Gospel of Philip, one of these texts, we find a striking line about Mary being the companion of Joseph, not a mystical vessel. And while the Church quickly dismissed these writings as heretical, the sheer fact of their existence proves that the virgin narrative was not universally accepted. Rather, it was one of many competing interpretations, and the one that survived was the one most useful to the emerging power structure. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself this: if the truth is eternal, why did it need to be enforced? Through censorship, why did whole libraries have to be burned? Why did dissenting voices have to be silenced? Is that the mark of divine truth or of human insecurity? The evidence is overwhelming that the latter is the case. For even within the canonical Gospels we see signs of contradiction. Mark, the earliest Gospel, never mentions a virgin birth. Paul, writing decades earlier, does not mention it either. Only Matthew and Luke introduce it, which means the story evolved over time, and yet by the time of later councils it was treated as absolute. This inconsistency is another piece of proof that the narrative was crafted, not revealed. Now let us consider another suppressed witness, the Proto-Evangelium of James, an apocryphal text written in the 2nd century which sought to reinforce the virginity of Mary, not only at conception but throughout her life. This text goes so far as to describe a miraculous midwife verifying Mary's intactness after birth, a grotesque and unnecessary detail that reveals the desperation of early Christians to defend a doctrine under attack. But why invent such bizarre embellishments unless critics were already pointing out that Mary lived as a normal woman? Can you see the paranoia here, the lengths to which mythmakers went to safeguard their fragile story? Now we must confront the Vatican archives, a fortress of secrecy that holds thousands of manuscripts never released to the public. Why keep them hidden? What is so dangerous within those shelves? Of parchment and ink, whispers abound that alternative gospel accounts contradict the perpetual virginity, that records of early debates reveal how divided Christians were, yet the faithful are denied access because the truth threatens the edifice of power. And here lies the greatest betrayal. The Church that claims to be the guardian of truth has hoarded truth away like contraband, locking it behind iron doors and armed guards, ensuring that the faithful kneel before myths while the evidence of reality gathers dust in secret chambers. Now consider too the Jewish records of the time, some hostile to Christianity, which mock the idea of a virgin birth, suggesting instead that Jesus was the illegitimate child of a Roman soldier named Panthera. While this claim is difficult to verify, its very existence shows that contemporaries did not take the virgin claim seriously. Rather, they saw it as an invention easily mocked. And yet the Church would have you believe that this was the central miracle of history, the very hinge of salvation. But the laughter of ancient critics tells another story, a story of invention rather than revelation, and the suppression did not stop in antiquity. Even in the Middle Ages, and Renaissance scholars who dared to question the virgin birth were silenced, books banned, authors excommunicated. The Inquisition hunted those who challenged Marian doctrines. Is this the behavior of an institution confident in truth, or one terrified of exposure? Reflect on that, for truth does not fear scrutiny, only lies do, and the virgin myth has been shielded from scrutiny for nearly 2,000 years. Now let us consider the broader pattern. In pagan religions, virgin births were common. They functioned as symbols of divine favor, and Christianity borrowed this pattern to give Jesus credibility. Mary was simply the vessel chosen for this adaptation. Yet in doing so, her humanity was erased. She was no longer a Jewish mother, but a mystical construct. Her story, rewritten to match the propaganda needs of the church, and this rewriting has had catastrophic effects, elevating virginity above motherhood, stigmatizing sexuality, distorting gender roles, and enslaving believers in guilt. And here is the haunting reflection. If Mary was not a virgin, then she was a woman like any other, and if she was a woman like any other, then Jesus was born like any other, and if Jesus was born like any other, then the entire edifice of divinity built upon this myth trembles. Do you feel the ground shifting? Do you feel the walls of illusion cracking? Because once this realization takes hold, there is no going back. The spell is broken, and this is why the church hides documents, locks archives, and silences dissent. Because the truth of Mary's humanity is the death knell of their empire, and yet the truth cannot be hidden forever. The discoveries of Nag Hammadi, the whispers from Jewish sources, the contradictions within the Gospels, all point to one inescapable conclusion. Mary was not a virgin, the church knew it, and it built an empire on the lie. And as more light shines into the darkness, the suppressed voices grow louder, telling us to question, to investigate, to refuse the chains of myth, for only then can faith be free. Only then can humanity reclaim its dignity from centuries of deception. And now we reach the final crushing conclusion, where all the threads converge, and the weight of 2,000 years of deception comes crashing down. Because if Mary was not a virgin, then the entire theological structure built upon her purity collapses like a house of cards, and the consequences are earth-shattering. For think of it this way. If Mary conceived in the ordinary way through union with Joseph, then Jesus was born as any other man. And if Jesus was born as any other man, then his claim to divinity loses the miraculous aura that the church has proclaimed for centuries. And if his claim to divinity falters, then salvation as constructed by the church is revealed as a fabrication, because the idea that a God required a sinless virgin to enter the world was not divine necessity but human invention. A myth borrowed from older pagan traditions and weaponized to control generations. Reflect on this. Billions of prayers whispered to the Virgin Mary, billions of rosaries recited, billions of candles lit in devotion to an illusion, and all the while the true Mary was silenced, her humanity stolen, her ordinary life erased in service of an empire of lies. Does this not feel like the ultimate betrayal? For believers gave their trust, their tears, their hopes to a story carefully engineered to hold them in obedience, and the leaders of the church knew it. They knew the mistranslation, they knew the contradictions, they knew the suppressed documents, and yet they chose silence because truth would destroy their authority. So they cloaked themselves in robes of holiness while hoarding archives of secrets, presenting themselves as guardians of truth while being the architects of illusion. But history is merciless. It always resurfaces, and today the evidence is overwhelming. Mary was not a virgin, she was a woman, and the myth of her virginity was a deliberate construction. And if this truth stands, then the implications are devastating, because if one of the central pillars of Christianity is false, what else has been fabricated? What else has been twisted? How many doctrines stand upon illusions? Is hell itself real or another invention? Is the resurrection literal or symbolic? What remains once we strip away the lies? These questions are not meant to destroy, but to awaken, to pull back the curtain and reveal that faith should never be chained to deception. And here is where the thought becomes truly liberating, because if Mary was not a virgin, then she was free to be human. And if she was free to be human, then her story can inspire us not as a goddess, but as a mother living under hardship, raising a child in a brutal world, enduring suffering and uncertainty. In that humanity, she becomes more powerful than any myth, for she becomes relatable, real, and true. Yet the church could never allow that, because truth empowers people, while myths enslave them, and they needed slavery of the mind. They needed obedience. They needed power. So they sacrificed truth on the altar of control, and now the burden falls on us to decide, do we continue kneeling before illusions, or do we stand in the light of truth? And the truth is this: the perpetual virginity of Mary is a lie. The church hid it, and the time has come to expose it. And as you hear these words, you may feel the walls of belief shaking. You may feel anger, sadness, even fear. But remember that awakening always feels like destruction before it feels like freedom. The chains are breaking. The myths are falling. and what remains is raw reality, the kind of reality that empowers you to see with your own eyes rather than through the lens of manipulation. So ask yourself once more, if the church could lie about this, what else has it lied about? And are you ready to know, because the journey has only begun, and the revelations that follow will be even more explosive than this? So if this truth already shook you, imagine what comes next. Subscribe so you do not miss the full truth, because the time of silence is over. The age of exposure has begun, and once you see the truth, you can never unsee it. Mary was not a virgin. The church knew it, and now you know it too. The illusion is shattered forever.